Hi viewers, L hope you are fine. The night my parents threw me and my grandfather out of the house, it was snowing so hard. I could barely see the road ahead of us. I still remember Grandpa's trembling hands gripping his old suitcase while Christmas music played softly inside the house behind us. Warm lights glowed through the windows. My younger brother and sister were laughing near the fireplace. And there we were, standing outside like strangers. Please, I whispered to my mother. Grandpa isn't well, let him stay tonight. But she didn't even look at him. You made your choice, Emily, she said coldly. If you want to defend him, then leave with him. I felt something inside me shatter. My grandfather had spent his entire life sacrificing for this family. He built the house with his own hands after my father lost his job years ago. He paid for my brother's college tuition. He even sold his treasured watch once to help my mother during her business failure. But somehow, when he became old and weak, everyone suddenly treated him like a burden. Especially after the doctors told him his heart condition was getting worse. That Christmas Eve, my parents invited relatives over for dinner. They decorated the house beautifully, pretending we were the perfect family. But behind closed doors, all they cared about was Grandpa's money. I discovered it accidentally. Earlier that evening, I overheard my father whispering in the kitchen. We need him to sign the property papers before the end of the month, he muttered. And if he refuses? My mother asked. He doesn't have many years left anyway. Those words made my stomach twist. I confronted them immediately. How can you talk about Grandpa like that? My father's face darkened instantly. You should stay out of adult matters. No, I said, my voice shaking. You're trying to take everything from him. That was the moment everything exploded. My mother accused me of disrespecting them in front of the family. My father shouted that Grandpa had already become useless. The room fell silent, and then Grandpa slowly stood up from his chair. His eyes looked tired, heartbroken. If my presence causes this much hatred, he said quietly, then Emily and I will leave. I begged him not to go. But he simply placed his hand over mine and smiled sadly. Sometimes, he whispered, people only show their true hearts when money enters the room. So we walked out into the freezing night together. What I didn't know then was that Grandpa had already made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. We spent Christmas Eve in a tiny roadside motel 20 miles away from town. The heater barely worked, the walls smelled old and damp. But somehow, sitting beside Grandpa while he quietly drank tea felt warmer than my own home ever had. Still, that night broke me. I cried silently in the bathroom because I couldn't understand how my own parents could become so cold. Grandpa knocked softly on the door. I wiped my tears quickly. I'm okay, but he smiled gently the way he always did when he knew I was pretending. You don't need to carry everyone's pain, he told me. I sat beside him on the small bed, and for the first time in years, he began telling me stories from his past. Stories nobody in the family ever cared enough to hear. How he worked double shifts after Grandma passed away. How he skipped meals so my father could eat. How he nearly lost everything during the recession, but kept fighting because family meant everything to him. Then his expression changed, but somewhere along the way, he whispered, your parents stopped valuing love. They only started valuing comfort. I looked down quietly. Deep inside, I knew he was right. The next morning, Grandpa collapsed while trying to stand up. I panicked and rushed him to the hospital. For hours, I sat outside his room terrified I might lose the only person who truly cared about me. Then a doctor approached me. He's stable for now, she said carefully. But his condition is serious. That moment changed something inside me forever. I stopped expecting kindness from people who had none to give. Meanwhile, my parents never once called to check on him. Not once. But 2 days later, they suddenly appeared at the hospital. Not because they were worried. Because they had discovered Grandpa changed his legal documents. I watched my father storm into the room with fake concern painted across his face. Dad, you scared us, he said dramatically. Grandpa simply stared at him silently. Then my mother pulled me aside. What did he change in the will? I froze. So that was all they cared about. I don't know, I answered honestly. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. That evening, after they left angrily, Grandpa asked me to sit beside him. "There's something you deserve to know," he said. He slowly handed me a folder. Inside were legal papers, bank documents, property records. I stared at them in shock. Grandpa owned far more than anyone realized. Several rental properties, land outside the city, savings accounts nobody knew about. And according to the updated will, everything was left to me. My hands started shaking immediately. "Grandpa, I don't want this." He smiled softly. "This isn't about money, Emily. It's about trust." Tears filled my eyes. "But they'll hate me." "They already chose hatred," he replied sadly. "You chose loyalty." For weeks, I stayed by his side while his health slowly declined. And during that time, my parents became desperate. They called constantly. They begged. They manipulated relatives against me. Some family members accused me of turning Grandpa against everyone. But none of them knew the truth. None of them saw how abandoned he felt long that Christmas Eve. Then one cold January morning, Grandpa passed away peacefully in his sleep. And with him, the last piece of my childhood disappeared too. The funeral felt empty despite being full of people. Relatives cried loudly for attention. My parents acted like grieving children in front of everyone. But I noticed something strange. My father kept glancing toward the lawyer standing near the back of the room. Waiting, almost impatiently. 3 days later, the entire family gathered for the will reading. The atmosphere inside the lawyer's office was painfully tense. My mother sat confidently beside my father, already discussing what renovations they would make to Grandpa's house. I sat quietly in the corner, exhausted from grief. Then the lawyer opened the file. "To my family," he began reading, "I once believed love alone could hold people together. But love without respect eventually fades." The room became silent. My father crossed his arms impatiently. The lawyer continued, "To my son and daughter-in-law, I leave forgiveness, because carrying bitterness destroys the soul." My mother's smile disappeared instantly. "And to my granddaughter Emily, who stayed beside me when I had nothing left to offer." My chest tightened. "I leave everything." The room exploded. "What?" my father shouted. "That's impossible." My mother cried. But the lawyer calmly placed the documents on the table. Every property, every account, every investment, all legally transferred to me. My parents were completely stunned. Then came the final sentence Grandpa had written personally. "True family is revealed not during comfort, but during sacrifice." I broke down crying immediately. Not because of the inheritance, but because even after everything, Grandpa still chose love over revenge. Meanwhile, my parents' perfect image slowly collapsed after the truth spread through the family. Relatives learned how they abandoned Grandpa during his final days. People stopped trusting them. Their business partnerships failed, and eventually, they were forced to sell the very house Grandpa once built for them. But I didn't celebrate their downfall. Because revenge doesn't always feel victorious. Sometimes it simply feels sad. Months later, I used part of Grandpa's money to open a small community home for elderly people abandoned by their families. I named it Grace House. Every Christmas Eve, I visit the garden behind the building where we planted Grandpa's favorite roses. And every year, I remember that freezing night when we stood outside together in the snow. At the time, I thought my life was ending. But looking back now, that was the night I finally learned the difference between people who share your blood and people who truly share your heart.